Reporters muttered and took pictures in the packed courtroom, which seemed tense. Sitting in the center of it all was Tiffany Henyard, the so-called super mayor, who seemed to be the personification of defiance and barely contained wrath. She walked into the court with the same haughtiness that had defined her entire political career, her chin up and a group of lawyers at her side who were likely being paid with public money. But when the prosecution revealed their bombshell, everything was different. The incriminating evidence, which included leaked audio, emails, and bank records, was shown on the courtroom's large screen. Brief flashbacks of hidden tape showed Henyard discussing bribery, backdoor deals, and the embezzlement of public funds. Her usual charm and easygoing manner disappeared in a flash. Her mask crumbled, exposing the woman who had built an empire through lying, and she remained still. Shock reverberated through the room. It was so silent. The residents of Dalton, who had once trusted her, now sat in stunned disbelief. For years, if not longer, they realized they had been manipulated. Henyard had positioned herself as an unstoppable force by spending lavishly, avoiding questionable financial records, and plastering her face on billboards. But now it was all out in the open. No one had been able to pin her down until now. When Tiffany Henyard lost it, the situation drastically changed. Her chair skidded across the glossy floor as she slammed her fist down the table. Now they were learning the truth. She sprang up and shouted, "This is a setup!" But the judge's gavel banged for order, and Henyard wasn't done yet. The room didn't believe her. She pointed an accusatory finger at the defense and yelled, "This is political. Y'all don't want a strong woman in power." The irony in the air was palpable. This was the same woman who had allegedly bullied local officials, slashed salaries, and funneled money into mysterious projects. And now she was playing the victim, a classic move. But it didn't stop there. In a final, desperate attempt to salvage her image, Henyard turned on her own legal team. "You had to handle this," she spat at her attorneys, her voice dripping with contempt. One of her lawyers, visibly embarrassed, began shuffling through his papers, while another refused to make eye contact. The cracks in her carefully constructed empire were now on full display. The facade was crumbling. The courtroom, once silent, buzzed with whispers and gasps. Henyard's grip on power, once seemingly unshakable, was slipping away. She had no answers, no deflections. The truth had caught up with her. And then, in an act straight out of a courtroom drama, Henyard did the unthinkable. She grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. The gasps that followed could be heard throughout the room, followed by chaotic shouts and confusion. Was she really leaving? Was she abandoning the fight? Yes. Yes, she was. For the first time in her political career, Tiffany Henyard couldn't spin the narrative. She couldn't silence the truth, no matter how hard she tried. She had lost, and there was nothing left to do but walk away in defeat. As the courtroom door slammed behind her, the people of Dalton sat in stunned silence. Their once unstoppable mayor had been reduced to nothing more than a defeated figure, walking away from the very power she had worked so hard to maintain. But the silence didn't last long. Those who had been manipulated, used, and deceived erupted into applause. Justice had come knocking, and Tiffany Henyard was running out of places to hide. The courthouse erupted into chaos as court officials pounded their desks, calling for silence while reporters scrambled to capture every moment. The scene was in utter turmoil as reporters hurried to grab microphones and shove them into the faces of everybody they could find. "Did you see her face?" One local said, "I told y'all she was crooked," as another laughed. "This is what happens when you mess with people's money," yelled another. Henyard's inner circle remained motionless inside the courtroom. While some urgently called, others gaped at the exit in shock. Now that their golden ticket to power had walked out, it was all for the men. The real fireworks started outside the courthouse. Henyard dashed out, her heels clicking frantically against the street as cameras followed her. "Mayor Henyard, Mayor, what are your thoughts on the recordings that were leaked? Are the missing millions of public funds real? After the hearing today, will you step down?" Henyard didn't respond to any of the inquiries, which came in quick succession. Cameras were pushed aside by her security crew, but to no avail. Like a swarm of bees, the press was on her. Then, just as it looked like Henyard could get away, a woman crossed her path. Not just any woman, though. Here was Dalton's former treasurer, who had quit months earlier after claiming that Henyard's administration had intimidated and harassed her. She was determined not to let this opportunity pass. "Tiffany, you can flee from the truth, but you can flee from the courtroom," she yelled. She appeared shaken for the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in her career. She had no control over the lies she had been telling, and they were unraveling right before her eyes. She was momentarily quiet, but the former treasurer wasn't done yet. "You silenced everyone, but guess what? You can't silence the truth," she continued, growing bolder as cameras continued to roll and more individuals gathered. The pressure increased. Henyard was clearly uncomfortable as she stood there, and just as she was about to go, she made the second worst decision of the day. She moved forward until she was just inches from the former treasurer's face and said something menacingly. What Henyard failed to realize, though, was the potential of live broadcasting. The former treasurer turned to the cameras and smirked as soon as she finished speaking. "You heard that right," she said, threatening me once more. Suddenly, social media was in full swing, with the hashtags "on camera" and "Fanarkot threatening Gosar again" gaining popularity and the entire world seemingly watching. The hashtag "Mayor Henyard loses on live TV, gets confronted and flees court" was widely used. Could this be the final straw for Dalton's most controversial mayor? Meanwhile, Henyard's hearing continued without her back inside the courthouse, and it only got worse as the questions came flooding in from all sides. The prosecution brought in even more damning evidence, such as the backdoor deals, the secret recordings, and the missing millions of taxpayer dollars, without her present to play the victim. Everything was on display for the world to see, and, without Henyard, there was no one left to defend the story she had meticulously crafted. The events went on. As the media demanded answers, the residents of Dalton at last started to comprehend the full scope of their betrayal. For years, Henyard had been the brain steering the story, but now she was losing control of it. The truth could not be avoided. Pictures of Henyard's breakdown went viral on social media. As she dealt with the fallout from her own corruption, the entire world watched. Was this the start of a much bigger unraveling, or would this be the end of her political career? The untouchable super mayor that Tiffany Henyard had formerly thought herself to be was no longer the case in any case. The formerly untouchable super mayor, Tiffany Henyard, was suddenly revealed for what she really was: a corrupt, power-hungry politician whose reign was quickly coming to an end. The people of Dalton were ready for change after finally seeing the truth. Henyard sat trying to maintain the appearance of control while the courtroom hummed with tense stillness. However, her empire of falsehoods came to an end when each devastating piece of evidence surfaced. The truth grew closer to Henyard, the more she attempted to avoid it. The residents of Dalton were finally recognizing her for what she had always been: a skilled manipulator abusing her position for her own benefit. The worst part? Her attempts to change the story had failed, the evidence only becoming more compelling. The lead attorney opened by saying, "Your Honor, we have uncovered a series of financial transactions totaling over $30 million that directly lead back to Mayor Henyard's administration." The prosecution's unwavering confidence and relentlessness sent shockwaves through the room as they clicked through a number of financial records. After a tidal surge of murmurs, there was startled silence. $30 million. This was outright embezzlement, not only poor budgeting or poor administration. Shell businesses, fictitious invoices, and enigmatic consultancy fees were all part of the perfect paper trail, which led to Henyard's closest allies. But the real kicker? Some of those deals have connections to properties outside of Illinois, in addition to Dalton. The courtroom was filled with questions about who owned the opulent houses in other states that had been siphoned off from funds intended for Dalton's public programs, safety, and infrastructure. The inner circle of Henyard, her closest advisors as well as her putative boyfriend. Yes, the same lover who had been present at every controversy but was noticeably missing today. There was no longer room for debate as the prosecution revealed. The unquestionable network of corruption. This was criminal mismanagement, not political. What's the best part? Henyard wasn't even present to put herself on the table. The judge, with a booming voice, announced, "It is within the court's power to authorize an official criminal probe into Mayor Henyard's financial dealings." And just like that, it was done. An official criminal investigation, one that could lead to federal charges. After much muttering about Henyard's wrongdoings, the people of Dalton finally had something tangible. It was no longer merely rumors. This actually happened, and there was a formal probe into Henyard. A mob of Dalton locals gathered outside the courtroom as the news came, their dissatisfaction finally finding a voice. Her days in power were numbered and the clock was ticking. When they heard the verdict, they erupted in cheers. "Lock her up. We got her at last." It was electrifying. As for Dalton, only a few blocks away, Henyard was still caught up in a media frenzy and was unaware of what was going on inside the courthouse. She continued to believe that she could play the victim and twist it. She was unaware, however, that her well-planned kingdom had already fallen apart. Tiffany Henyard had been ruling Dalton with an iron fist for years, putting down opponents, stifling whistleblowers, and manipulating the system with the brutal accuracy of a seasoned political hustler. As the chants outside got louder, she started to realize the truth of the situation. However, the system retaliated this time. Henyard's phone rang in the midst of the confusion. One of her closest advisors was this person. Before responding, she paused, her voice brimming with annoyance. "What? Madam Mayor, it's bad," she screamed. And the speaker on the other end was obviously in a panic. Real bad. Henyard clenched her jaw. How bad? She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the weight of what was happening crushed her. For the first time in her career, Tiffany Henyard realized the full extent of her downfall. There was a moment of silence before the words came tumbling out. "The investigation is federal. They're pursuing you." Her heart skipped a beat. Federal charges. This was a serious criminal case, and if the feds were involved, there was no getting out of it. Tiffany Henyard had nowhere to run, no narrative to spin, no victim card to play. The power she had wielded with such ruthless efficiency was slipping through her fingers like sand. Calls, messages, they kept coming, but Henyard had already lost control. The investigation, the leaks, the tapes, it was all too much. The life she had so carefully constructed on a foundation of corruption, intimidation, and deceit was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Inside the courthouse, the judge's decision was final. The criminal probe had been authorized. The years of rumors and whispers had finally come to a head. The truth had been laid bare, and no amount of political maneuvering could save her now. The people of Dalton were finally getting the justice they had long been denied. For Henyard, the victory of justice was bittersweet. Sitting in her car, she could hear the chants from the crowd outside. Her phone buzzed, but she didn't answer it. The weight of the impending federal charges sank in. She was no longer the untouchable political force she once believed herself to be. She was now a woman on the run. The people she had used, bullied, and deceived were finally holding her accountable. The consequences of her actions were no longer just a matter of public opinion. They were real, and they were coming for her. The police officers who had once been her personal security detail now watched her closely, not as protectors, but as law enforcement officers waiting for their orders. Her staff, once loyal and eager to please, had scattered. Her lawyer, typically by her side, avoided eye contact, leaving her isolated in the face of mounting evidence. Even her boyfriend, the same man who had been with her through every scandal, was nowhere to be found. Henyard had burned too many bridges, and now she stood in the middle of a crowd that had turned against her, desperate to see her fall. The crowd's cheers grew louder, and Henyard's mind raced. She had always been able to talk her way out of tight spots before, but this was different. A shaky breath escaped her lips. She sat frozen in her car, her phone buzzing incessantly as the full weight of her situation hit her like a ton of bricks. "They're coming after everything," she muttered to herself. "Everything. Her administration's finances, her personal transactions, her hidden accounts, the properties she owned in other states. Panic gripped her. She spun around looking for an escape, but there was no one to help her. For the first time in her political career, Tiffany Henyard was completely alone. Across town, the news channels were covering the unfolding chaos in real time. Breaking news. Mayor Henyard under investigation. Criminal investigation. Full financial probe into corruption scandal explodes flashed on every screen, and the weight of the revelation was too much to handle. Then, on live television, a whistleblower who had worked at Henyard's for years came forward with evidence that dispelled any doubt. "I worked in that office for years," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "and I saw how the money moved, how taxpayer dollars were funneled into private accounts." The interviewer leaned in wide-eyed and threatened me when I attempted to speak up. Threatened by whom? The interviewer's eyes widened as the crowd gasped as the woman said, "By Tiffany Henyard herself." "You're saying Mayor Henyard threatened you directly?" "Yes," the lady replied, "and not just me, anyone who got in her way." As the whistleblower produced a small black recorder, the camera zoomed in. She added, "I have proof," in a firm, determined voice. I captured it all on tape, and the newsroom went silent in shock. Tiffany Henyard knew then that she was finished. Back inside the courthouse, the prosecution wasted no time. "Your Honor," the lead attorney said, standing tall and confident, "given the overwhelming evidence presented today." The courtroom was electric with the weight of the moment as the judge, having heard the shocking evidence, let out a slow breath. "Based on today's proceedings," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension, "I am authorizing law enforcement to begin an immediate investigation into all financial transactions linked to Mayor Henyard's office." She had used intimidation and fear for years to silence anyone who dared challenge her, but now the very people she had threatened and intimidated were fighting back, with evidence to bring her down. Standing in the middle of it all, Henyard could feel the walls pressing in on her. She had thought she was untouchable for so long, but now that the whole might of law enforcement was around her and federal investigators were ready to look into every move she made, she realized her reign was over. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric. There was celebration, chanting and cheering. Like wildfire, word spread that Henyard was about to fall. All they said was, "Lock her up." The atmosphere was electrifying, and Henyard, who was confined a few blocks away, had no idea what was happening behind the courthouse doors. She believed she could spin her way out of this situation, still holding on to the hope that she could be saved by her political scheming. Justice for Dalton. The truth was known, though, and this was the first time Tiffany Henyard had lost control of her career. The FBI was pursuing her, and she had nowhere to hide. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't answer it this time. Her closest lawyer was on the line, but she knew deep down that nothing anyone could say could change the reality of her situation. Henyard clenched her jaw, trying to keep herself together. But the weight of her fall from power was too much to bear. The damage had been done, and there was no way out of the mess she had created. Finally, the residents of Dalton had uncovered her plot, and now they had the evidence to expose her. Everything was coming together, including the financial paperwork and the leaked tapes, and she was powerless to stop it. The pandemonium in her head contrasted sharply with the revelry outside. There was a tangible sense of enthusiasm in the crowd. Protesters screamed calls for justice while waving signs. The first arrest warrant dropped just when Henyard believed things couldn't get any worse. One particularly stunning protester held up a huge banner that distorted Henyard's own campaign slogan, from "For the People" to "For Her Wallet," a vicious criticism on her years of corruption and misuse of power. It was for someone extremely close to Henyard, her top financial advisor, rather than for Henyard herself. Not just yet. Reporters rushed to verify the breaking news within minutes, and several sources confirmed that authorities had issued an arrest warrant for this senior official in Henyard's government. What's the actual kicker? There was the FBI. Henyard was now the subject of a federal investigation, rather than merely a local one. Panic struck as the full extent of the issue became apparent. Her voice was tight with desperation as she turned to face her lawyer. "Take care of this," she said. However, her attorney's response lacked the customary assurance. He looked at her, and that glance said 1,000 words. "Even I can't save you now," it said. The truth of her predicament became evident for the first time. Henyard was no longer in charge. She was no longer evading responsibility by making meaningless claims, dismissing charges with a smile, or bullying detractors into quiet. It was the height of the fall from grace. Henyard recognized this wasn't simply another PR nightmare she could ignore as she stood frozen outside the courthouse, watching her political empire fall apart and before of her eyes. That was the end. The residents of Dalton were cheering her demise rather than merely seeing it. Justice was finally catching up to Tiffany Henyard after years of corruption, dubious transactions, and the complete misuse of authority. This time, there was no way out. As word got out, focus shifted to the expanding probe. Everyone's next concern was whether this was the start of something bigger. The financial investigation was only beginning. The walls were closing in and the FBI was circling. More arrests appeared certain, and those around Henyard were already flipping. What was the extent of this rabbit hole's depth now? Or, more dramatically, would Henyard try to flee before the hammer really fell? Or would she try to make a deal to save herself? Her options were quickly running out. The residents of Dalton, whom Henyard had tricked, coerced, and exploited for her personal benefit, waited in expectation in the background. Would they at last receive the justice they so richly earned? There was more to this political controversy than that. Justice was finally within their grasp, which was the moment they had been waiting for. However, the story wasn't finished yet. Even though Henyard's world appeared to be falling apart, there was still a lot more to happen. Would Tiffany Henyard find a way out of the mess she made, or would she wind up in jail? The narrative was far from complete, and as it developed, everyone was anticipating the next episode. As the controversy developed, everyone's attention was focused on the specifics in order to keep ahead of it. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. People were telling one another to stay informed. Believe me, this is only the beginning of this story, and there will be many more updates as the situation develops. The people had to be vigilant, educated, and as usual, follow the money while they waited to see what would happen next. Even though Henyard's empire was in ruins, her demise was just beginning. Thank you for viewing Celebrity Insider.